Joseph Kotrie-Monson joins me, Director of Melanie Onn Solicitors. They specialise in sexual offences and serious crimes. Joseph, very good evening to you.
Good evening, Ian.
I would contend to you that what we've just heard there from Gina, I mean, that is something that ought to be subject to the law, whereas I would contend that wolf whistling is probably a little bit over the top to say that should be subject to the law.
It's interesting, isn't it? And I think Miss Martin has made some excellent points about the fact that this conversation is even taking place, changing attitudes, is a very important first step. I think there is rightly a distinction, and there's more of a tension, of course, with what we might regard as unacceptable or yobbish behaviour that isn't necessarily intended, even though it ends up being unpleasant or can be hurtful, but isn't necessarily intended to be malicious or hurtful in the form of, what some rather crude men might call banter. But nevertheless, there is a tension in that between free speech and, of course, the right of people to not be bothered by strangers. On the other hand, and of course, upskirting, which absolutely should be a criminal offence. You are speaking to a male criminal defence lawyer who is a proud feminist, and the idea that this type of behaviour, which on the one hand, which really could only be intended for two purposes on the perpetrator's part, and that's either to cause upset or for sexual gratification. And of course there is that range. There is, of course, the cheeky 11-year-old or even 8 or 9-year-old boy, the equivalent of looking up girls' skirts, and that absolutely shouldn't be criminalised. And I think if there is legislation, which there should be, it should be very clear that there must be sexual intent associated with it, because boys are fascinated with knickers. And the reality is that there should be a dose of common sense about kids messing around, and I think too many kids are criminalised. There's a lot of sensible police officers who recognise that and decide to deal with these things in a more informal way and a more sensible way.
I'm going to make a terrible admission here and admit that when I was at primary school, I got the slipper for looking up the teacher's skirt.
Well, I'm very glad you admitted something like that on
Taught me a lesson.
Because you're not going to catch me doing it.
Is the key thing here the difference between banter and harassment, where if somebody wolf whistles a female in the street and leaves it at that, is that acceptable at all, or when does it become harassment?
If a son of mine did that, and I don't have a son yet, I have a daughter, but if a son of mine did that, he'd get a talking to. That's unacceptable behaviour among right-thinking people, in my view. Should there be a cause to legislate against it? I think it very much depends on the context. I hate that word banter. I regret using that in this interview, because banter is often a word used for men actually behaving in a really inconsiderate way. Is there a point at which the rights of free speech clash to the extent that they need to be legislated against when behaviour becomes targeted and nasty? There probably is. Arguably, of course, the law does provide in those types of circumstances offences under the Public Order Act. I'm thinking really of Section 5, abusive, insulting words or behaviour, which, it's a criminal offence. It's not a sexual offence, but it's something that can really prevent somebody getting, in their job, or hinder people in their job prospects in the future, etc. So, there is legislation that exists once something turns nasty. But, I think there's a wider argument here. There are a lot of men who are very sympathetic to these arguments, a lot of men who think, something needs to be done. But when they hear what they would regard to be an overreaction against, the normal interaction between men and women, and where the balance of that lies, I don't know, and I'm not saying I think all of this behaviour is justified, but the point at which people start saying, well, this should be a sexual offence, people should be on the sex offenders register as a result, is the point at which a lot of moderate people think, you know what, you lost me there. And I actually think that...
Well, you see, Gina did that, didn't she?
Argument, more harm than good, arguably.
Gina, I think I'm right in saying, unless I misinterpreted it, at the end of that interview, I said, what punishments do you think there should be for upskirting? And she did mention the sex offenders register, and I did think to myself, that's a bit much.
Well, you know what? She mentioned cases where there are 50 people, 50 photographs on somebody's phone, and they are compulsive, and they're doing it for sexual gratification. Should those people be on the sex offenders register? I think the public and the police really should be, if that's something that we have the sex offenders register and it's for a purpose, arguably there's an argument that they should fall into that. But you're right, there is a range, and I think Gina, precisely, Miss Martin, that's precisely what she was saying, that there is a range, between one type of offence and another, and probably proportionality is a sensible thing, but the legislation shouldn't be too wide. If it is, everybody gets
All right, Joseph, thank you very much indeed. That's Joseph Kotrie-Monson from Mary Monson Solicitors.